The clinic was too quiet for a place that dealt in new beginnings. Sterile white walls, polished floors, the faint hum of machines working behind closed doors. But the silence inside exam room 4 was the kind that clung to the air, waiting for something to break it. Graham Caldwell sat at the end of the consultation table, hands steepled, jaw locked. He had reviewed hundreds of profiles in the last 2 months, all of them medically sound, emotionally stable, legally uncomplicated. But none of them stopped him cold like this one. Ellie Carter, 23 years old, clean health history, no psychological flags, background checked, no substance use, no partner involved, and then there was one sentence. Patient has never been sexually active. The fertility specialist kept speaking, unaware that every other word had become background noise. Hormone cycles, cervical preparation, uterine lining, embryo viability, the usual routine script. But Graham was no longer listening. His eyes were still fixed on that sentence, as if the font had shifted, as if the page itself had spoken. Ellie sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, calm, composed. She wore a modest navy blouse, black slacks, a faded blazer that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back, her posture straight, and her expression unreadable. She knew what was in that file. She had read it, too. The doctor paused when he noticed Graham's silence. Given her first-time status, we'll need to begin with a gentler dilation protocol to ensure— Stop! Graham's voice cut through the room like a blade, low measured final. The doctor blinked. Excuse me? We're not going forward. Not today. Ellie's head turned slightly, but she said nothing. Her jaw was set. Her back stayed straight. The specialist cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, with all due respect, the labs are excellent. Her compatibility markers are ideal. If the issue is the procedural sequence, we can— It's not the procedure. Graham closed the folder, stood. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Everyone out. The nurse hesitated. The doctor looked from Graham to Ellie, confused. Now, he said. The room emptied slowly. The door shut with a soft click. Ellie and Graham were alone. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't shrink. If this disqualifies me, just say it, she said. Graham studied her face. No makeup, no pretense, just steady eyes and a calm that didn't come from naivety. It came from choice. You've never— No, I haven't. She didn't look away when she said it. Does that change things, Mr. Caldwell? He didn't answer, not right away. He stepped closer, but not too close. His voice dropped, quieter now, but just as sure. I am not the kind of man who takes something sacred from a woman just because a contract says I can. Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. So what happens now? His eyes didn't leave hers. I cancel this, and I make sure you never feel like your first decision was desperation. She tilted her head slightly. That's not your responsibility. He nodded. That's exactly why it matters. In that moment, the tension between them was not about money or biology or logistics. It was about something deeper. Choice. He wasn't walking away because she scared him. He was walking away because she didn't. And that changed everything. Ellie Carter didn't grow up dreaming about penthouses or private clinics. She grew up in the quiet corners of a small Ohio town, where the roads cracked from winters too long and summers too dry, where the corner store kept a running tab for families who always came up short. She was the older sister who learned how to scramble eggs by 8, fold laundry by 9, and change her mother's oxygen tank by 11. Her mother, Lorraine, had once been a music teacher, known for her soft voice and strong will, but after the stroke, everything changed. Ellie dropped out of her sophomore year in college to take over the role no one else could. She cleaned houses during the day, worked at a diner on weekends, and took late-night shifts at a grocery store to keep the lights on. Her dream of becoming an art teacher was quietly packed into a storage box under her bed, alongside sketchbooks and letters from professors who once believed in her. She didn't complain. Complaining never paid bills. Instead, she moved through life with a kind of focused silence. Her clients often described her as polite, dependable, invisible. That was by design. People didn't ask too many questions when you stayed quiet and kept things clean. At 23, she had already lived a dozen lives most people never saw. So when she saw the surrogacy listing a private, confidential arrangement offering $500,000 in exchange for carrying a child, she didn't hesitate. She calculated hospital costs, therapy sessions, a better wheelchair, a safer home for her mother. For a brief moment, it felt like freedom was possible. She knew what people would say, that she was selling her body, selling something sacred. But to Ellie, this was not a sale. It was a choice, a difficult, deliberate, fiercely personal choice. What she didn't expect was him, Graham Caldwell. At 34, he was everything she wasn't. Born into wealth but forged by fire, he carried the kind of power that never needed to raise its voice. CEO of a billion-dollar software company, he had the calm of someone who had won battles in silence. He was not loud, not arrogant, not careless. He was deliberate, efficient, controlled, and deeply alone. Graham grew up in Connecticut inside a house that was always perfect and always cold. His mother struggled with depression. His father built empires but never once asked his son how he was sleeping. Graham learned early that love came with conditions, and silence was safer than disappointment. He excelled in school, earned scholarships, built his first app in a garage, sold it by 25, and by 30 had founded one of the most successful tech firms in New York. People admired him. Investors trusted him. But no one knew him, not really. He had been engaged once, briefly, a beautiful woman with sharp ambition, perfect posture, and zero patience for Graham's boundaries. She laughed when she realized she couldn't mold him into the man she wanted to parade. Since then, Graham had stopped chasing the illusion of romantic compatibility. He wanted a child, not for legacy or press, but because he wanted to do better than his parents. He wanted to raise a child with warmth, with truth, with steady hands. Surrogacy for him was logical, controlled, emotionally neutral. Until Ellie, when he first reviewed her file, he noted her stats the way he had hundreds of others, but something about her caught him. The clarity in her application, the absence of victimhood, the simple way she stated her intention. I want my mother to have a second chance at life. That's all. There was no manipulation, no appeal to emotion, just quiet strength. And then the detail. Patient has never been sexually active. It wasn't a problem medically, not in the world of science and contracts, but it became a problem the moment he looked at her and realized this wasn't a transaction anymore, not for him. That detail, so clinical in the file, became a weight on his conscience. He couldn't reduce her choice to a calculation, not when it was her first time, not when it was her body, not when it was desperation dressed in dignity. That's when everything began to shift, not just for Ellie, but for him too. Ellie did not expect to see him again. After he dismissed the clinic staff and shut down the procedure, she assumed that was the end. She had seen men like Graham before, or at least she thought she had men, who wore expensive suits, made fast decisions, and disappeared just as quickly when the cost became inconvenient. She figured he would move on, find another candidate, and forget she ever existed. She was wrong. 3 days later, a check arrived at her apartment. It came by courier, sealed in a plain envelope. The return address was discreet, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. $5,000 made out to the rehabilitation center currently handling her mother's care. No note, no message. Just a simple wire confirmation attached to the receipt. Ellie stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just folded the paper, put it in a drawer, and wrote a letter. It wasn't dramatic. She thanked him for his concern, returned the check in full, and wrote a single sentence at the bottom. I didn't agree to the contract because I wanted pity. I agreed because I needed a solution. She mailed it the same day. No return address. If he wanted a response, he'd have to find her, the way she found her strength on her own. Meanwhile, life continued. Ellie returned to work at the Winthrop estate, dusting shelves and ironing shirts she could never afford. On Sundays, she took her mother to physical therapy, pushing the old wheelchair down cracked sidewalks in the fading light. She clipped coupons, washed secondhand uniforms, and made coffee with a cracked machine someone left behind in the staff kitchen. She thought about Graham only in flashes, the way he looked at her, not with desire or distance, but with restraint, as if trying not to say something he hadn't prepared. That haunted her more than any memory of rejection. 2 weeks later, they crossed paths again. It was at a charity auction for a literacy foundation. Ellie wasn't invited as a guest. She was working coat check, part of a rotating crew of weekend hires. She wore black slacks, a borrowed white blouse, and a name tag she had to write by hand. Graham arrived with no entourage, just him in a slate gray suit, holding a program and scanning the room like he was looking for a reason to leave. He saw her within minutes. Their eyes met across a sea of tuxedos and sparkling dresses. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Later that night, after the auction ended and the last coat had been claimed, he approached her outside the service exit. His tone was soft but certain. "I'm not here to fix anything," he said. "I just want to understand." She didn't move. "Understand what?" she asked. "Why you said yes. Why you walked into that room knowing what it would take." Her voice didn't waver. "Because I've carried people my whole life. My mother, my brother, myself. I figured one more weight wouldn't break me." His eyes darkened. "And you think that's strength?" She nodded. "It's what I had left." He didn't argue. He simply asked, "Would you let me buy you a cup of coffee?" Ellie hesitated, but only for a moment. Something in his tone wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polite. It was honest. She said yes. They met the next morning at a diner in Midtown. No bodyguards, no luxury cars, just coffee, eggs, and a corner booth with cracked leather seats. Graham asked questions, but not the kind that invaded. He asked about her art, her favorite books, whether she preferred sunrise or moonlight. She answered slowly, carefully, and then all at once. Something loosened between them. Not attraction, not yet, but a kind of safety. They started meeting every week, sometimes in public places, sometimes in quiet ones. No expectations, no agendas, just two people who had never been seen clearly by anyone else. One day, while walking through Central Park, Ellie stopped by a statue she had passed 100 times. "Do you ever wonder what it's like to be still?" she asked. Graham looked at her. Still how? Not waiting for the next disaster, not planning the next move, just still. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't think I've ever been." She looked up at him. "Maybe that's why you saw me. Because I was." That night, Graham sent a donation to the rehab center again, but this time anonymously. Ellie never mentioned it. She knew. And he knew she knew, but some things didn't need to be acknowledged to be understood. It was on a rainy Thursday that the shift became undeniable. Ellie's mother suffered a complication fluid in the lungs, aggressive fatigue, sudden loss of mobility. The hospital bill rose fast. The insurance declined coverage. Ellie panicked. She called every number she had, asked for extensions, offered double shifts. Nothing moved. Graham found out through one of his legal aides who had continued monitoring the medical fund at Graham's quiet request. He arrived at her apartment building the next evening, no driver, no coat, just a soaked shirt and a white envelope. Ellie opened the door and froze. "I don't need charity," she said. "This isn't charity." "Then what is it?" He hesitated. "It's me trying to do something before you have to break again." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let them fall. "That's not your job," He nodded. I know, but maybe it's mine anyway. She stepped back to let him in. For the first time, he saw the living room. Small couch, one lamp, two chairs, a bookshelf filled with library sale books, and a framed drawing that looked too good to be anyone else's but hers. He stood in silence. She joined him. The room didn't feel small anymore. It felt shared. Graham handed her the envelope. It wasn't money. It was a sketch pad. Inside was a note. You don't owe me anything, but if you ever need to remember why you're still standing, draw it. Ellie clutched it to her chest, and something inside her shifted. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need it. The distance between them was gone, not because he crossed it, but because she stopped needing to keep him out. Ellie didn't know how to name what was happening between them. It wasn't dating. There were no flowers, no reservations, no social media moments. It wasn't friendship either. Graham never asked her what she thought of his business deals, never brought her into rooms filled with people who spoke in numbers and nodded with power, and yet there was a closeness that neither of them questioned. They spoke like people who had run out of small talk. The silence between them was never awkward. It was safe. On Sunday mornings, they sometimes met at the flower market. Ellie liked to smell everything before picking just one. Graham never rushed her. He watched her the way someone watches art being made, quietly, without trying to interfere. One afternoon, they sat in a bookstore cafe, nursing lukewarm tea and sharing a cookie. Ellie was sketching something in her pad, the one he had given her, while Graham scrolled through news headlines with half interest. She looked up suddenly. I never asked. Why surrogacy? He didn't answer right away. He set his phone down and folded his hands. Because I didn't trust myself with the other kind of love. The romantic kind? The kind that pretends not to be conditional until it is. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. He leaned back, watching her. And you? Why did you say yes in the first place? Her pencil stopped. She stared at the page. Because I thought if I could just do this one thing, then everything else would stop falling apart. My mom, the house, the hospital bills, my life. I thought it was an equation I could solve with sacrifice. Graham didn't respond with sympathy. He didn't lean forward or reach for her hand. He just said, "And now?" She looked up. And now? I wonder if that equation was never mine to solve in the first place. The moment lingered. Something in it felt heavier than usual, as if they were standing on the edge of something neither of them had agreed to name. The next week, Ellie received a letter in the mail. Not a bill, not a notice. An offer. Scholarship grant to finish her teaching degree at a local university. She had applied 2 years ago, long before she ever heard the word surrogate, and forgotten about it entirely. But there it was, waiting, with a modest tuition package and an early spring start date. She stared at it for hours. Later that evening she told Graham. He smiled, but not in the polite way. He looked genuinely proud. "You should take it," he said. "I can't. I work 3 jobs. My mom still needs care, and classes aren't cheap even with help." "I didn't say it would be easy. I said you should take it." She frowned. "Would you help me if I did?" "I'm not asking for money. I'm asking if you'd stand next to me while I tried." He nodded without hesitation. "I would," Ellie didn't reply, not right away. But the next morning, she dropped off her application acceptance at the registrar's office and walked the entire way back home. No bus, no train. Just the sound of her own footsteps and the knowledge that someone believed she was allowed to start again. That winter, Graham pulled away slightly. Not emotionally, not completely, but noticeably. He didn't return texts right away. He canceled one of their usual breakfasts. Ellie noticed, but she didn't panic. When they did see each other again, it was at his office. She'd come to drop off a holiday sketch she had made of his late mother's favorite flower, something he once mentioned quietly in passing. When she arrived, the receptionist looked surprised. "He's in a board meeting," said no interruptions. Ellie nodded and left the package with a note. The next day he showed up at her door. "You came to see me," he said. "I did. Why?" "Because you matter to me, even when you make space I didn't ask for." He exhaled. "That's what I needed to hear. I didn't mean to pull back. I've never had something feel this real without it falling apart." Ellie stepped aside, letting him in. "Then don't run. Just sit with it, even if it scares you." They spent the evening talking about anything but themselves, books, movies, childhood memories, but when the quiet came, it wasn't heavy. It was earned. Ellie fell asleep with her head against his shoulder, and Graham didn't move for hours, afraid that shifting would break the peace they had finally found. January came with snow and a phone call. Ellie's mother was stable enough to return home part-time. Her brother was accepted into a summer science program across the state. Things were, for once, going right, and that terrified Ellie. Happiness, to her, always felt like the pause between disasters, but this time it lingered. Graham was there. Not every day, not in every way, but in the moments that mattered. He helped her move furniture to make space for her mother's return. He fixed a leaky faucet without being asked. He brought soup when she had the flu and didn't ask to come inside. He just left it at the door with a note that said, "I'm here when you're ready." Ellie wasn't used to that kind of love. Quiet, steady, patient. It unnerved her, made her want to find the catch. But there wasn't one. One night, she asked him directly, "Why me?" Graham stared at her for a moment before answering. "Because you never asked to be rescued, and somehow that made me want to protect you more than anyone else." She didn't respond. She couldn't. The words caught in her throat, wedged between disbelief and gratitude. Later, when she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized she wasn't scared of being hurt. She was scared of being fully seen, and he had already seen everything. The next morning, she sent him a text. "I'm ready." He replied within seconds. For what? For whatever comes next. That was when Ellie understood that the story they were writing didn't have a contract, or an expiration date, or a dollar amount. It had presence. And that was more than she ever thought she'd get. Spring arrived slowly, as if the city was unsure it deserved warmth again. Ellie stood at the edge of a crosswalk near campus, the acceptance letter folded in the pocket of her worn-out coat, the sun brushing the tops of buildings like a promise half-kept. She had started classes a week earlier and already felt the ache of exhaustion in her bones. Early shifts, late lectures, microwave dinners eaten while typing essays with one hand and holding her mother's meds in the other. But somehow, she didn't feel empty. She felt like she was moving again, becoming. Graham was still present, never loud, never demanding, but constant. He texted her good luck before exams, dropped off sketch supplies on Fridays, and left coffee outside her door on mornings he knew she barely slept. They didn't define what they were, not officially, but there was rhythm in their closeness, a kind of silent understanding. Until the hospital called again. Her mother had fallen in the bathroom, a broken wrist, minor concussion. But what worried them most was the decline in motor function. That one proved painful to put into words, a kind of moral insanity. Ellie sat by the hospital bed that night, fingers clenched around her phone, staring at a message she hadn't sent. She could type the words. She just couldn't let them go. "Graham, I can't do this again. I thought we were through the worst of it, and now it feels like we're back at the beginning. I don't have space to keep holding everything. I want to fall apart, but I don't know how." She deleted it, rewrote it, deleted it again. He showed up anyway. She didn't tell him, didn't call or text, but somehow he arrived. No bouquet, no dramatic entrance, just him, standing at the hospital door, holding a bag of her favorite crackers and a jacket she left in his car 2 weeks ago. She didn't cry when she saw him. Not right away. She just leaned her forehead against his chest and let out a breath that carried more weight than words ever could. They sat in silence. He didn't ask what happened. He waited. When she finally spoke, Her voice was tight. "I feel like I'm always on the verge of breaking." Graham rested his hand gently over hers. "Then maybe you're not supposed to carry it all alone." She looked at him. "I don't know how not to." "Then let me teach you." That was the moment she realized she wasn't afraid of being seen anymore. She was afraid of being held and forgetting how to let go afterward, but Graham didn't ask her to let go. He just stood beside her and made room. A week later, she made the decision. She withdrew from one of her classes, just one, to make space for her mother's recovery. It wasn't quitting, it was adjusting. For the first time, she chose to be kind to herself. Graham didn't congratulate her like a mentor. He supported her like a partner. They had dinner on a Thursday night in her apartment. It was quiet, with mismatched plates and a flickering candle she had salvaged from a clearance bin. She served pasta from a thrifted pot, and he brought wine in a paper bag. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was real. After dinner, she asked him something she hadn't dared say before. "Do you still want to be a father?" He nodded slowly. "I do. I just no longer believe I have to do it alone." She tilted her head. "With me?" "Only if it's something you want, not because of a contract, not because of what almost happened, but because of what we found since." Ellie was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "I've never been anyone's choice, not really. Not when it meant staying." Graham leaned forward. "You've always been mine. I just needed to grow into the man who was worthy of saying it out loud." The air shifted, not with tension, but with permission. That night, when she led him to her bedroom, it wasn't out of fear or need or pressure. It was her decision, entirely hers. There was no rush, no grand declaration. Just hands meeting hands, eyes meeting eyes, and a quiet understanding that what they were choosing was not just intimacy, but trust. She undressed slowly, not shy, but intentional. He followed, matching her pace, not claiming, not consuming, just allowing. When he touched her, it was with reverence, not hesitation. She felt every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of awareness that this was not about ownership. It was about recognition. Their bodies met like puzzle pieces long separated, not for completion, but for comfort. There was no performance, no pretended passion, just quiet fire. When she came undone, it was not loud. It was layered, soft gasps and trembling release held gently in arms that had no intention of letting her fall. Afterward, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. She lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat that felt like safety, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel responsible for keeping anyone else alive. She just felt alive. Morning came with golden light and no regrets. Graham made coffee in her tiny kitchen, barefoot and humming some half-remembered tune. Ellie sat on the couch, wearing his shirt and sketching something she couldn't yet define. When he handed her the mug, he didn't say anything profound. He just kissed the top of her head and sat beside her. They didn't talk about what came next, but somehow both of them knew they had already begun. 3 days passed without seeing each other, not because of distance, but because life demanded it. Ellie had to attend a series of makeup classes and appointments for her mother, while Graham was traveling out of state for meetings he could not postpone. They kept in touch, short texts, a voice message or two, but no pressure. Still, something shifted in the quiet. One evening, after Ellie put her mother to bed, she sat on the floor of her bedroom, back pressed against the wall, holding her sketchpad. She flipped through pages of unfinished thoughts, rough outlines of emotion she didn't have the language for. In one drawing, Graham's profile appeared unintended, sketched from memory. The jawline, the eyes, the way his mouth tilted slightly when he held back a thought. It startled her. She had never drawn someone without realizing it. That night, she couldn't sleep. When morning came, she didn't go to class. Instead, she took the train to the business district, stood across the street from his building, and watched people in expensive shoes walk in and out with phones in hand and purpose in their stride. She didn't know what she expected to find there. Maybe it was clarity, maybe it was closure, but she stood for almost an hour, invisible among the crowd, wondering if what they had was real, or just a beautiful pause in a life too difficult to romanticize. Graham noticed her before she had the courage to walk away. He was on the 12th floor when he glanced out of the window and saw a figure that looked like a question he wasn't ready to ask. 20 minutes later, he walked out the front entrance. No jacket, no assistant trailing behind him, just steady steps until he reached her. "You okay?" She nodded, but didn't smile. "I just needed to see if this was real outside of the quiet moments, and... Is it? I don't know." That scared her more than she expected. Graham reached for her hand slowly. "You don't have to know yet. You just have to stay long enough to find out." She hesitated, then laced her fingers through his. "I'm not used to someone holding on without needing to be pulled." "Then let me be the first." They walked together, no destination in mind, just steps in sync. At a small cafe, they sat in a corner booth, shared a warm cinnamon bun, and talked about everything except what they were feeling, until Graham finally asked, "Do you want a family someday?" Ellie froze for a second, then answered, "I used to think I'd have to build it alone. Now I think maybe I don't want to build it unless I feel safe in it." He nodded, taking her answer like a blueprint. "What if I told you I'm not afraid of the messy parts? What if I told you I want to be the person you call when it gets hard, not just when it's good?" She looked at him, really looked, no polished charm, no calculated words, just a man who meant it. "I would say that scares me more than being alone, because if you mean that, and something goes wrong, I don't know if I'll be strong enough to come back from it." Graham's voice lowered. "Then let me carry it when you can't." Ellie didn't cry. She breathed in slowly and let the idea settle in her chest. That night, back in her apartment, she sat beside her mother, who was now stronger, more alert, smiling more often than not. As they watched a rerun of some crime drama, her mother asked quietly, "That man, he's different, isn't he?" Ellie nodded. "And you care about him?" "I do." Her mother studied her face, then stopped looking for a reason to leave and start finding a way to let yourself stay. The next morning, Ellie did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the storage box under her bed, pulled out the old sketchbook from college, and flipped through it. She paused at one page, a drawing of a classroom filled with children, all smiling, all holding crayons. She ran her fingers over the pencil lines. That afternoon, she applied for a part-time art assistant job at the community center. A few hours a week, nothing big, but it was a step toward the life she used to imagine. When she told Graham, he didn't say, "That's great," or "I'm proud of you." He just smiled and said, "Of course you did. You've always been this person. You're just finally letting her live again." Ellie leaned against him, her heart still guarded but her breath steadier than it had been in months. A week later, they went to visit a property Graham had recently purchased, an old brownstone in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, worn but full of potential. He handed her the keys. "I want to restore it, make it a space for something that matters, maybe even turn it into an art and learning center." Ellie turned the keys in her hand, unsure. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to help me design it, not as a favor, as a partner, in whatever way that word makes sense to you." Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from recognition. She had spent so long building walls, she had forgotten what it felt like to be invited into something meant to last. Later that evening, they stood in the kitchen of the brownstone, the light spilling in through a cracked window, and Graham said something she hadn't expected. "I'm falling in love with you, Ellie." She turned to him, eyes wide. "You shouldn't say that unless you mean every piece of it." "I do." "Then say it again, when I believe I deserve to hear it." He stepped closer. "I'll say it every time until you do." And for the first time, she didn't flinch when he touched her. because it no longer felt like he was reaching for something to take. It felt like he was reaching for something to give herself, her choice, her peace, and she was finally ready to receive it. 1 year later, the brownstone stood tall, restored but not polished to perfection. Its walls still carried the echo of old lives, but now they welcomed new ones. The front steps were worn from real footsteps, not staged visits. Inside, laughter replaced the silence that once clung to forgotten rooms. The building had become a small community center focused on art, healing, and second chances. Ellie taught weekly classes there, painting, sketching, even storytelling through visuals. The children loved her not because she was perfect, but because she saw them clearly. She remembered names. She saw the pain behind jokes, the hesitation in silence. She taught not just color and form, but how to make space for feeling. Graham supported the center without fanfare. He didn't put his name on the building. He didn't give interviews. He simply showed up fixing things, reviewing permits, walking kids home when it got dark. He had traded boardrooms for basement repairs and late-night grant applications, and somehow he looked more whole than ever. They weren't married. Not yet. But their life together needed no label to be real. They lived in a modest home nearby, where Ellie still brewed her coffee in the chipped machine and Graham still hummed off-key in the mornings. Her mother, now stronger, helped coordinate caregiver programs at the center. She often joked that Ellie had gone from housekeeper to heartkeeper, and she wasn't wrong. On the anniversary of the center's opening, Ellie stood in front of a room full of neighbors, students, and families. She wore a simple blue dress, no jewelry, no prepared speech. Just her. Graham stood near the back wall, arms crossed, eyes steady, listening like the words mattered more than applause. Ellie looked out at the crowd and spoke softly. "A year ago, I thought the only way to survive was to sell the last part of myself I hadn't already traded for rent, food, or medicine. I didn't think anyone would show up for me unless I gave them something first. But then someone did. Someone said no, not because I wasn't enough, but because I mattered too much to be treated like a transaction. That no turned into space. That space turned into trust, and trust over time became love. Not the loud kind, not the kind that begs to be posted or praised, the kind that shows up in quiet ways, in waiting, in listening, in choosing again and again without needing to be chased." She paused, letting the words land. "This building isn't a gift, it's a reminder that healing isn't a miracle. It's a process. It's showing up when you're tired, believing when you have no proof, and making room for others even when your own heart is still learning how to stay open." The room filled with quiet applause, the kind that comes from people who have been moved, not entertained. After the event, Ellie stepped outside for air. Graham joined her without speaking. He simply handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no grand gesture, just a question written in his careful handwriting. "Whatever we build next, can we build it together?" She didn't answer right away. She looked up at him, at the man who once stopped a contract to protect something sacred, and now asked not for a promise, but a partnership. She folded the paper, placed it against her chest, and whispered, "Yes," not because she owed him, not because she was finally healed, but because she knew the truth now. Real love doesn't require perfection. It just needs presence, and someone willing to choose you, even on the days you struggle to choose yourself.